Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, Book 1, Sword of Summer, by Riordan. Okay, so funny story here. I had no intention of reading the Magnus Chase books before I finished the Percy Jacksons, which I started and just never got around to finishing. Stupidly, what it was I owned them on Kindle, the first 3, and read through them, liked them. Then my Kindle died, and for some reason, it seemed wrong to me to go out and buy a paper copy of Book 4 when I only had an electronic copy of the first 3. So I just never continued them. And then, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a secondhand store, and I saw Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard. They had Book 1 and Book 3, and I was like, you know, they're cheap, they're here, I might as well. And then my stupid butt walked out of that bookstore with Book 3, not Book 1. And when I went back to get Book 1, it was already sold. So I had to go out and order this one online, which did not end up saving me any money. But the important thing is I now own Book 1 and Book 3, and was just praying that I would enjoy Book 1 enough to bother buying the rests. And outlook is good. So Magnus Chase books are very similar in premise to the Percy Jackson series. Basically, the ancient gods were real, they are still around, and in the modern times, and as in the traditional stories, they cannot keep it in their pants, and so are producing demigods left, right, and center. The difference here is that Magnus Chase books are based in Norse mythology versus the Percy Jackson books in Greek. Sword of Summer starts with Magnus Chase living on the streets. He is living on the streets of Boston and has been since his mother was killed about 2 years ago. And suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, his family starts searching for him. Now, before his mother died, she warned him to never go to his family for help, especially his creepy uncle Randolph. But when Magnus sees his cousin Annabeth, and yes, it is the same Annabeth from the Percy Jackson series, searching for him, he decides to investigate why. This sets off a ridiculous series of events that will see Magnus discovering his divine heritage, traveling the 9 realms, facing his mother's killer, and possibly setting off Ragnarok. Now, there's another one of those synopsises that makes the book sound about 100% more serious than it actually is. This book is far more fun and playful than doom and gloom, but we'll get to that. First, I want to talk about mythology and how mythology is used in fantasy. I've seen a lot of media that reinterprets mythology for kids. Objectively, it's fair to say that all fantasy is in fact some degree of reinterpreting or reimagining mythology, though it varies in level of how direct we're talking. But a lot of the stuff that is really direct reinterpretation of mythology, especially for kids, comes across a lot like Disney's Hercules. It's fun, it maybe covers some of the basic story, but it completely misses the boat tonally. Riordan books are not like that. I noticed when I read the Percy Jackson books, and I noticed again when I was reading this one, that he really captures something special. There's a faintly alien logic to a lot of mythology. People don't act the way we expect them to. Gods act more human than, like, Christian idea of God does, but the gods don't act like we would expect people to. They often make choices that seem just out of left field to us, but often sometimes it's even the world seems to run on a cause and effect that does not match what we see as normal cause and effect. Riordan captures that really well. There's a scene in this book where Magnus is trying to eat falafel with his friends when a pigeon comes up and interrupts him and starts threatening him. And yes, the pigeon is talking. And yes, I did mention that this book is a hell of a lot sillier than it sounds in premise. But Magnus's response to this pigeon threatening him and eating all his falafel is to hit it with a sword. And his sword sticks to the pigeon, and the pigeon flies away, dragging Magnus across town. And all of this, there are like 7 steps in there that make no damn sense. And yet it feels so much like what heroes actually go through in a lot of mythological tales that it really fits the world. And I think that's why kids like the Riordan books so much. They don't actually want the mythology softened. They don't want the weirdness and the danger filed away from these stories. They want the real stories. On the other side of that, I have read a lot of books in the last 10 years that are sort of counters to that, saying, oh, kids want real violence and real gore, so we're going to put a lot of real violence and creepy gore in our kids' books in a kiddie kind of way. And it often feels sort of patronizing. Like, a lot of it feels as if the author's saying, I understand you, child. I know you can handle it. You're a big boy or girl. But Riordan doesn't feel like that either. It just feels really honest to the mythology. And of course, a large portion of that comes down to the violence. Riordan does not do the Disney thing, and yes, ironically, the book is published by Disney, even though I'm saying Riordan is not very Disney-like, but he doesn't shy away from the violence of mythology, especially not the violence of Norse mythology. There's no denying the fact that the Norse culture was a warrior culture. There's a lot of nuance here that I feel like is often lost when you are just listening to internet dude bros talk about, yes, I'm a Viking, I'm a warrior. But objectively, Norse mythology is a lot about battles and violence and fighting and death. And this book includes a buttload of it. There are a huge number of deaths for a kid's book. Magnus cuts off someone's nose at one point. People casually talk about cutting off heads. Characters get hit by arrows, stabbed, cut, and beaten. And yet, the death's not always permanent. But the point is, there's a lot of death here. But it doesn't really bother me. It doesn't feel like it's inappropriate for young readers. And a lot of that is because the violent moments are softened mostly by comedy. A lot of the most violent moments are juxtaposed with moments of cartoon-like imagery, bad jokes, and silly tones. Now, each time I've picked up a Rick Riordan book, I have been surprised by how young they feel at the beginning. They have very simple writing, not complex sentence syntax. The writing level is usually around 5th grade-ish, but there's more to it than that. Rick Riordan is trying really hard to at least softly imitate the way his characters, his teen characters, would actually talk. And honestly, I'm not sure he always accomplishes it. Like, honestly, in this book, Magnus is supposed to be 16, and to me, he read more like a witty 14-year-old. But it's not that far off. And I think that part of the reason it does feel younger than it's actually supposed to be, and why it feels young to a reader, is because of how silly a lot of it is, how playful the writing is. For example, the chapters are titled things like, Don't Call Me Beantown, like ever. We have a decapitation party with egg rolls, and How to Kill Giants, politely. But the same silliness lets us get to know Magnus and his sense of humor. It makes him really, really likable. And the thing I find really fascinating about the Rick Riordan books is they somehow build up to serious emotional impact without me ever noticing. I always get started reading these books thinking like, oh, it's so silly. Like, this is barely a step above Looney Tunes. There are no stakes, no threat. It's hard to care about the characters because I have less than 0% doubt that the heroes will actually survive this and come out the better for it. But somewhere along the way, I keep ending up getting invested. The threats become real, and I do start to worry about the characters. It's really impressively done, and I suspect that this is another case of the aggressively voicey tone helping to endear the characters to the reader. An example of this. The first few chapters, there are a lot of jokes and playful references to the fact that Magnus is homeless. There is no emotional attachment to any of this, because he's not taking it seriously, and so we don't either. It's all just passing jokes and silliness. But as the book goes on, we find out more about why he is homeless. We see passing hints of what he misses about having a home. We see a longing for a place. And yet, we're not really paying attention to it because they're not attached to the comments of homelessness. Then at the end of the book, he makes another seemingly silly reference to being homeless, but there is so much weight to it. We understand what it really means to him this time, and it actually hit me pretty hard. Like, it hurt. Magnus, in that moment, did not sound like a kid. He sounded like a young man who has been through a lot of really difficult things. And in the end, this is one of those books that shows that taking the time to really carefully build the relationship between your reader and your character really makes for a strong emotional impact. There's one other thing that I would like to talk about with this review, and that is fate. Norse mythology is one that leans really heavily on fate, especially all the stuff about Ragnarok. I mean, all the gods already know exactly who they are going to be fighting and in the final battles and who will win these fights. Many of them already know that they will die and how they will die. And yeah, that's a big part of this book. There is a lot of examination of and talk about what it means to be fated to do something and to know what that fate is. And while fate has been part of human storytelling pretty much as long as humans have been telling stories, it's actually a really difficult trope to work with. I know other people don't find this problem as bad as I do, but it really bothers me. It makes it hard for me to get into a story when I already know what the ending is going to be. And I feel like that's a problem that I've had with the concept of Ragnarok from the very beginning. It's like, how do I get emotionally invested in the silly games between Thor and Loki if you already know what's going to happen to them in end times? And yeah, everyone in this book is very clear that Ragnarok is coming, probably soon. It is inevitable. There is no avoiding it. It's just a question of how soon. And to me, that just sort of adds a sense of melancholy to the entire book. Now, on the other side of that, I'm really curious about how this book will connect with the Percy Jackson series because of it. Because there are a lot of similarities between Norse and Greek mythology, but Ragnarok is a very different apocalyptic event than the ones that threaten Greek mythology. And I never finished the Percy Jackson series, so I don't know how much of Greek apocalyptic stories involved in that series. But I just really want to see what the connections are here. I want to see exactly how much of a player Annabeth is going to be in this series, and if the Greek gods become a player in this series. Like, I'm really curious, and it actually works really well to draw me back in after my with the whole concept of Ragnarok, because now there's options. If we have another set of gods that could get involved, how does that change things? So, I'm curious. But honestly, I don't know. It's one of those things I'm going to have to wait till I finish the series to give a final judgment on whether or not I like the whole heavy Ragnarok themes. But I do think I will be reading the rest of these books. I enjoyed this one. And even with the faint hint of melancholy of Ragnarok, they maintained a fun tone, which is always my preference in pretty much any form of media. So yeah, these are fun, and even with all the violence, I would recommend them to a rather young audience.